Excellent. Well, welcome everybody. I'm really glad to have folks with us. I know it looks like we'll have some other people joining us here as we go, and that's great too. My name is Josh Rockey. I'm the lead faculty for communication courses at Colorado Technical University, and really thrilled to be here. This is my I don't remember how many years that I've been presenting here at the ELCC conference, and I really appreciate it. I was just saying um, to Julie that I really appreciate the kind of peer-to-peer interactions of this conference, and just it's one I look forward to every year. So I'm happy to be here with you today. I'm going to talk a little bit today about generations in the classroom, and specifically what I call linear, or not what I call, what is called linear versus nonlinear learning. And I will tell you just up front that this is an area that I've been looking at for a while now. I've been thinking about and studying, but it is a work in progress. I think this is still something that, is one of those things that we're still working on and looking at. And so sometimes in these types of presentations, I find that I have more questions and answers, or present more questions and answers. But hopefully there'll be some thought-provoking information here that you can take back with you and consider how you might approach these types of things in your own institutions. So again, glad to have you with us. Um, Advancements in technology have really fundamentally changed the way that we learn. Right. And that's no big secret that the technology has impacted the way that we learn. As such, the educational process that has been largely unchanged for, 1,000 years or more has experienced monumental changes in a relatively short period of time. Right? Generational differences do mark one of those significant dividing lines in this change, I think, and many of us serve in institutions that have multi-generational student populations. So I think this is a topic worthy of consideration and discussion for us. And so that's what I'm going to hope to bring some ideas to you today that you can think about and take back to your own institutions. So, as we think about generations in the classroom and linear versus nonlinear learning, what I want to talk about today is first just some generational learning tendencies, just some overall learning tendencies for different generations. Then talk about some differences in linear and nonlinear learning, some of the primary differences there, and then what this means for us and some institutional considerations, things that we may need to think about as we process all of this. So. To start, the generational divide that I'm talking about today, that I'm referencing, comes roughly between Generation X and Generation Y, more commonly known, which is more commonly known as millennials. And that, so when we start with Generation X on the one side, that includes then also the baby boomers and the builders, which came before, and then the divide happened kind of around the time of Gen Y or the millennials, and also then would include or impact in the same way Generation Z and Gen Alpha, which we haven't seen too many of those in our institutions yet. They're still coming. That's the next wave is Generation Alpha, right? Gen Alpha. But that dividing line kind of happened between Generation X and Generation Y, and specifically the tipping point for that separates linear learning in the older generations and nonlinear learning in the younger ones came with the broad accessibility and use of the World Wide Web. Okay, so I'm a Gen X. I'm fully a Gen X person. So I mean, I remember when the web came out. For kind of public use. I'm talking about, just for kind of everyday use. I used it sparingly in college. We had to, if I wanted to use the internet in college, I really had to go to a lab on campus. Having it off campus was really kind of it was a luxury, not something, and it was really, really slow. So we didn't use it a lot off campus. But so I'm familiar with the internet, but I didn't live on the internet growing up like folks in the next generations did. Gen Y, Gen Z, Gen Alpha, those generations have grown up living on the internet essentially. I mean, it's just been kind of a fully integrated part of their life. So with that in mind, then the generations who learned to learn, right, if we think of it that way, how in a lot of times in school, we're learning how to learn, right? So generations who learned how to learn before the widespread availability of the web received knowledge from subject experts, subject matter experts, such as teachers, right? In a structured and step-by-step system that moved along a very precise layered path. Right? These learners are more accustomed then to a traditional in-person training method, emphasizing memorization and repetition, right? So if you're my age or older, if you're Gen X or kind of older, that's what school was, right? We went to specific classes and we memorized dates and information and where punctuation goes and things like that. And then we repeated it over and over until it was stuck in our mind and we could remember it and pull it out of our mind when we needed to. But it happened in this very precise and regimented way, right? Not only the individual classes, but the way those classes were structured was oftentimes you had to take one before you get to another and so forth. But so that's just kind of we learned to learn that way in a very methodical, structured way. But the learning process for those generations who grew up plugged into the internet, so Gen Y, Gen Z, Gen Alpha, that grew up plugged into the internet and having full access to that virtually at any time, and now, especially with the advent of smartphones, having it literally at our fingertips at all time, um, they are very much accustomed to autonomous discovery and finding information themselves because they can just look it up on their own. The information is, again, literally always at their fingertips. So learning is on demand. And they can engage in what we call just-in-time learning, meaning adding knowledge as they go and as it becomes relevant to their present situation. I think about just-in-time learning. I think about our son a couple of years ago. He had a car, and it's an old clunker, so that was the car that he had at the time, and the water pump went out on this car, and I would have said my thinking is, well, I don't know about that much about cars, enough to do that anyway. So I would have taken it to a shop. He looked up a YouTube video. He ordered the part. He looked up a YouTube video. He had never done this before and had never had any training in this, but he just, looked it up on the internet, found a tutorial, and went ahead and changed the water pump. It was pretty amazing. And he did it for a lot cheaper than I could have done, by taking it to a mechanic. So they just look this information up as they need it. And so instead of this, methodical straight line learning, my thinking would have been, well, to do that, I need to go to school to learn to be a mechanic and then learn all about the engine and do that because that's how the process goes, right? But for him, as a younger generation, it was just, no, it's out here. I just need to find that information and then apply it. So instead of this methodical straight line learning experience that I'm accustomed to and the way that I learned to learn, the learning for generations that came after Gen Y, Gen Z, Gen Alpha is nonlinear in nature and kind of doesn't work in a straight line necessarily. It jumps all over. So that's where this generational divide comes from and takes us, and again, that precipitated by the availability of the web, basically, and that on-demand information. So there are four key differences, though. Now that we've kind of discussed the general, idea of the generational divide, I want to talk about four key differences between linear and nonlinear learning that really differentiate those two things. That's structure, the driver, pace, and focus. Those are the four key differences. So let's take a look at each of those factors here. So the first difference we want to consider is structure, and by that I mean the framework on which the learning process is constructed. Okay, how is the learning process built, and what's it built around? So the linear process for learning follows a predetermined path, as I said. So we think about traditional textbooks. It starts with you have chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3, and so forth, right? And then we start at the beginning of that book, and we proceed through each of the chapters. They build on each other. And then we file away that information as we go. This is the Gen X, the Boomers, and generations before that as well. But that's how we learn because that's what we had available, right? So we would go through the book and in order, and our teachers would take us through it in order, and make sure we had all that information, and we would store it away to be able to pull it out when needed. Hopefully, that's the idea anyway. Right. So this kind of learning environment, as I said, creates and reinforces the linear structure of learning, where you start at A and you go through to Z, right, in order. You start at 1 and you go through to 5, and because it builds on each other. You can't just jump to 3 or 4 because you have to have that knowledge of 1 and 2 first to get there, right? That was the idea, and that's the kind of the belief that the older generations grew up with. Nonlinear is network-based, though. So it's network-based, allowing learners to jump between topics based on curiosity or necessity. I mean, again, the information is out there. When it comes to your mind, you just look it up. You go find it, right? And also consider the process that these younger generations have of navigating the internet. And this is one of the key illustrations here. When you're on the internet, you don't just go from, it's not like a traditional book where you go from page 1 to page whatever to 200 all the way through in order. When you're on the internet, you get in somewhere, you get halfway through an article, and there's a hyperlink in there, and that looks interesting. So let me click on that, and I'll go there, right? It's clicking hyperlinks and going down rabbit holes, and maybe you finish an article, maybe you don't, but you don't go through the internet from A to Z, right? You're jumping around, you're clicking through stuff, and you're pursuing knowledge as it comes up. That's the nonlinear process of learning, right? That's the nonlinear process of learning when it's not all in one straight order. And that's what they grew up with because, again, the internet and the World Wide Web was such an integrated part of their life that they became accustomed to that. That's what they're used to, and that's how they learn. So this type of experience creates and reinforces a nonlinear structure of learning. Again, it doesn't go straight from one to five. It goes from one to four and then four to three. And then you jump to five and go back to one because you missed something there and you come back. And so, I mean, you're just picking up this information as needed, kind of that just in time experience, right? So this is what creates and reinforces that nonlinear structure of learning. I found this illustration from a guy named Brian Mathers, who has a site called Visual Thinkery, which is really great. I encourage you to check it out. It's, again, Visual Thinkery is what it's called. But he had this illustration to kind of, and I like this, this linear versus nonlinear learning. You go from start to finish. Linear learners go from start to finish. They go straight through the forest and they pick up the knowledge as they go. Right? Nonlinear learners are wandering about the forest, visiting the different trees and picking up information that they need at that time as they go. And to accompany this, Mathers had a quote as well with this or statement that he had. He said, "I don't think we learn well in straight lines. At least I don't. To learn is to understand. To understand is to explore in multiple directions, multiple times. What I bring to a learning experience is different to what everybody else brings because we have all had different experiences." So I just, I really appreciated this illustration as I was have been looking into this thing. So again, I encourage you to check out more from Brian Mathers at Visual Thinkery. It's really great. So that's the first key difference, right? The structure, the actual structure of the learning process is different. It's not, again, literally not a linear process for later generations. It's nonlinear. They bounce around, and I think that example of the, just cruising the web is an excellent illustration. So the next factor I want to talk about, though, the next difference that we want to consider is the learning driver. Right? In other words, what is the motivator or driving force behind the learning experience? Why are we seeking to learn? For older generations, learning tends to be content driven. Right? There's a predetermined framework of knowledge and a set curriculum for attending it, and it's all laid out in very precise and, again, very methodical. In this format, information then is pushed out to the learner, and distribution then is dependent on that subject matter expert. So again, it's dependent on the teachers. So this is where if you're familiar with that expression, sage on the stage, that's what's happening here. We have to have that subject matter to push the content, push the information out to the learner, and the whole purpose is to retain that content. We're content driven. Older generations are content driven, and that's how we learned to learn when we were looking to learn. So, for younger generations, on the other side of this, the nonlinear learning process for younger generations is highly learner driven. It's highly learner driven, not content driven. It's dependent on the learner because information is readily accessible on demand whenever they want it at their fingertips. Again, learning is pulled rather than pushed, regardless of when we push it, it's regardless of your interest or your relevance or whatever. But younger generations are used to pulling that information based on their needs in that moment. What do you need? Because it's always accessible. We don't have to have that content in advance. We can pull it out of the air whenever we need to, off the internet, right? So information is pulled, and that has led these learners to prefer the guide on the side approach to the traditional classroom setting. Again, if you're familiar with that, sage on the stage versus the guide on the side, younger learners prefer that guide on the side because they can then, access what they need when they need it, and not have to depend on the subject matter experts as much in that moment to deliver that content only at that time when they choose to. Okay. So that's, thinking about the driver. We talked about structure, the driver of learning experience. The pace of learning is another key difference in between linear and nonlinear learning. So the pace of the learning. Um, Linear learning is often very rigid. It provides kind of a singular path for all learners. There's only really kind of one road to go down for this learning. Again, think about, when that teacher teaches in the classroom, at least traditionally. Now, this, for example, this session is being recorded and we can access it later. But when we were in school, those weren't recorded. And so you kind of got one shot to get this information. If you missed it, you missed it. Now, this may seem to enhance kind of the equity of educational opportunities, thinking about, well, everybody gets the same thing. And that's true. That is the equitable way to do that. But it can be a little problematic to expect every learner to take in and utilize the information in the same way, regardless of their inherent skills and abilities and interests. Right. So if you've seen this kind of a famous illustration about, for a fair selection, everybody has to take the same exam. Please climb that tree. And you've got different animals with different abilities who are obviously going to struggle to accomplish that task in the same way. But that's the equitable way to do that, right? But sometimes equity can be problematic as well. And so in this case, it means that a singular pace with everyone expected to move at the same speed, right? In the linear learning process, everybody has to go at the same pace. Everybody has to be at the same thing. And so it doesn't accommodate for people who learn differently or may not pick up on that subject as quickly. And I know, the flip side of that is that sometimes students who feel like, well, students get bored sometimes if they feel like it's not moving fast enough sometimes, right? So it's going to hit maybe some of the students, but some may find it too fast or too slow and have difficulty with that. So, but that's just, the pace of linear learning is that everybody goes at the same kind of speed. That's just how it works. But nonlinear learning allows for multiple paths that can be personalized to that individual. Right? So you can all kind of take a different pace. And it's not just in terms of the content, but in the speed of the delivery and the progress, because learning is more autonomous. And so students can kind of move at their own pace, faster or slower as needs be, and they can receive that content at different rates and different at a different pace. Yeah. The flexibility fits with the just-in-time learning preference of nonlinear learners, especially learning what they need when they need it. So they don't have to wait necessarily. If they have something they want to know, they can access it right now. And so that the pace tends to vary for each person, and actually what they're learning about varies a great deal as well. But and much of this is made possible because of the abundance of the digital tools that can now be employed for learning, and also the digital tools that can be employed for monitoring and evaluating that learner. I know at CTU we're a primarily online institution, so we have to be able to monitor what students are doing, but they can do that kind of at their own pace to a large degree. There are deadlines and structures and things that they have to meet, but they can do it kind of at their own pace and in their own time. But then we also have the digital tools that make it possible for us to monitor who's doing what lessons are they doing, how are they doing on those things, what questions are they getting, where are they struggling. We have, the abundance of digital tools that are available now on the other side of things too, on the educational side, are pretty incredible, and allow us to then monitor, even though students are going at a different pace. Allows us to monitor those things. So but pace is a consideration as well between linear and nonlinear learners. The final key difference that I want to look at, and then I'll take a break. I want to make sure I'm not missing anything in the chat. But the final key difference to examine is the focus, or think of what's the purpose of that learning experience for linear and nonlinear learners. Right? So for linear learners, oftentimes, so linear learners again are older generations. That the focus is to build those foundational, consistent skills, right? To establish those foundational, consistent skills. And in this format of learning, knowledge is often siloed, so topics are separate and distinct. Again, thinking about when I was in school, you went to an English class, you went to a math class, you went to a science class, and there wasn't much crossover between those things, at least not direct crossover. There wasn't a lot of collaboration necessarily between departments, and it was kind of that siloed approach to learning. An application and kind of cross usage of the information is left to the experience of the learner. So we're establishing For these generations, we were establishing those foundational skills, and then the assumption was that as you get into the workplace or as you get into your life or whatever, then you'll figure out how these things work together and where they cross over, and you figure out how to use them and apply them really in a practical way. But that was not necessarily part of the learning experience. At least in my experience, I recall very few teachers in high school, and really not very much when I was in college, even, where they said, "This is how this is going to be useful." And this is the applied nature of this. They always just said, "You're going to use it. Don't worry about it. Just you'll use it. You'll use this is important. You'll use it down the road." But nobody really explained why. Um, and certainly didn't talk about how, these things would cross over with one another. The topics would. It was very, very much a siloed approach. But um, again, in my experience. So that's for linear learning, but nonlinear learning focuses on adaptability, problem solving, and interdisciplinary connections, right? That's really the focus of this because, again, we don't have to, in their view, we don't have to worry about the knowledge. The knowledge is there. The knowledge I can access anytime. I just get on the internet and I can find the knowledge. What I need to know is how to use it and how to develop these other skills like problem solving and effective communication skills and adaptability to situations. So their focus is on functionality and on application. So rather than specific content, success in learning then for these generations is measured by the ability to apply that knowledge to the problem or situation at hand. Right? The challenge is not to have that knowledge available in your mind. The challenge is to what's the use? How do I use this then? What's the application here? Okay. I'm going to take a pause real quick just to look at the chat. I know we've had some comments, and I want to answer any questions or respond to comments, and then I'll talk about institutional considerations as well. Um, yeah, and if you have questions, please jump in anytime, or comments at all. Please feel free to jump in anytime. That will not faze me in the least. I'd welcome that really. So um, yeah. YouTube is pretty incredible. I mean, the internet in general, but YouTube in particular has become this really fascinating thing for me as well. I see, Leanne, that first of all, I'm just amazed at how much our kid. I mean, my wife and I, we still watch network TV. They think that's so archaic that we watch network TV, and I mean we have streaming services as well. But I mean, all their content comes from YouTube. Almost all of it comes from YouTube. They watch these YouTube channels like they are television shows. It's pretty incredible. Um, but they do, yeah. Again, my son used that YouTube straight up YouTube video to change the water pump in his car, which I just found amazing. With no prior knowledge and no help from me, no help from anybody else. He just watched the YouTube video. He'd ordered the part, watched the YouTube video, and got it done. So, yeah. And a project learning or project based learning high school, yeah. Schools are changing, right? I mean, schools are adapting. So they're uh, finding ways to accommodate these different um, learning processes and things. So okay, so we have a question. Um, so given we have the most diverse age cohort in higher education than ever before, how do you build a course for all these learners? Yeah, that's the million-dollar question, right? That's the million-dollar question. I mean, you're gonna see that my next slide is titled Institutional Considerations and not Institutional Solutions because that's a challenge. I don't know. I mean, the hard answer is that we almost develop, I don't know, the more work for us. I mean, we develop a curriculum that accommodates kind of both in some ways. And so yeah, I mean, it does require some adaptation, and it's going to be a challenge. It's something which again, as I said, I said at the beginning, not everybody was here, but I said at the beginning, this is still kind of a new top. I mean, I'm still exploring this and still thinking about it. So I have more questions, I think, than solutions, than firm solutions. But maybe I do want to talk a little bit about the considerations. But again, that's why this says considerations and not solutions, because I don't know that I have a foolproof answer for that question. But the first thing on the slide is actually the multiple generations may be in the same classroom, and it's going to require some variety in our pedagogical strategies. We have to, we certainly have that at CTU. We have people from Gen Z to all the way to baby boomers in pretty much every one of our classes, and almost kind of evenly distributed. I'd say our average age is probably somewhere between 35 and 40, but we have students from all over the place, generationally and diverse in every other aspect as well. So it does require, I would say more individual consideration for me. That's been one of my approaches, or one of the things that I've had to do more of is think about who that student is individually. So when I get a message from a student, trying to place, okay, when they're expressing a concern about this assignment, is it because, is it a generational thing? Is there a way that I need to explain this? If I know that they're, Generation X or a baby boomer or something, do I need to explain this in a step-by-step way and just tell them how it needs to be done? And that's, you give directions because again, content is pushed, right? So they're expecting me as the instructor to just tell them what to do and how to do this thing, right? Not, so they can get an automatic A or whatever, but they're expecting explicit instructions on how to do this. Younger generations are expecting when I respond to them, they're expecting something more, not just to give them the answer straight up in a list format or whatever. They're expecting me to walk through why this is important and how they can approach it, theoretically, and how they can get their own brain around it. They don't want just the step-by-step instructions, in other words. So as an instructor, I have to think about, okay, who is this student? And this is a big part of it for me. Generationally, what's their age? I don't always know their exact age, but I generally get a sense. We have introduction activities and things for our classes. So thinking about that, but really, so the hard answer is because we have multiple generations in the same classroom, the truth is I have to work harder as an instructor to accommodate that. And we do that in a variety of different ways anyway, because we know that students all learn differently. So good instructors, try and provide a variety of things, but we also, in our courses, in our comms courses, we have traditional textbooks that we use and things like that that are available to students, but to accommodate different students, and this is a generational thing too. We've put some videos on YouTube because we know they enjoy YouTube. They like YouTube. They feel comfortable there. They feel at home on YouTube. So we created some short, what we call mini lectures between 5 and 15 minutes. So for each unit that we have, we'll have 4 or 5 mini lectures that are led by instructors in the course. They're specific to that content for that unit week. It's not just it's not just videos that we pulled from YouTube in this instance. These are videos that we created and then we house on YouTube to make them available for students. But so we have videos. We also do pull videos and resources, articles and things from other sources so that students can bop around a little bit if they don't want to do the traditional textbook thing. Whoop, sorry, I just zoomed in, I think. I don't want to do that. How do I do that? Here we go. Okay, better. Sorry. So we just try a variety of things, and some of it we can do as kind of a department. We can do it, in a wider way. Like those videos are available in all the classes, and we have a resource guide that we put together for students that lists and has links for all the readings and all the videos and everything all together there, so they can access what they want. And but so some of it we can do department wide. Others stuff is just going to be up to the instructor. Like I was saying, when I get a question from a student or about an assignment or something, this is one of the factors that I have to consider is what are they expecting from me because of their learning experiences and their generationally maybe they're learning, how did they learn to learn, in other words. So anyway, it's so I'm afraid there's no easy answer, but that's one thing. Multiple generations in the same classroom, absolutely, you're going to have that, and so we're going to have to look at providing some variety in our pedagogical strategies and how we reach these students and how we interact and engage with them. Another thing to consider is that learning opportunities now exist 24/7, thanks to asynchronous technology in virtually every class, even face-to-face classes. I think for the most part, and I'm not teaching any face-to-face classes at the moment, but even when I do, I provide lots of resources that are available asynchronously, videos, content, everything else, so that students aren't just dependent on me because they don't want to be just dependent on me teaching in front of them anymore. They want to have access to these resources and be able to do things on their own as well. So learning opportunities exist 24/7 thanks to this asynchronous technology. So curriculum design has to anticipate that and what I call the ongoing learning cycle. I think about now we talk a lot about the 24. I'm a media guy too, so we talk about the 24-hour news cycle. Right? The news is no longer, back in the day, it was just the nightly news from 5 to 6 or whatever, and that was the news cycle. Now it's a 24-hour news cycle, and everybody knows that, right? So, and the same is true for learning. We have a 24/7, 24-hour learning cycle. Students are learning. I can learn at all times and need access to these resources. So curriculum design is going to have to anticipate that and try and provide those types of materials and opportunities for students asynchronously as well. Another thing to remember is that knowledge becomes, and this sounds so weird to even say, but knowledge becomes obsolete really quickly in the modern era. Not only because it's available, knowledge is kind of cheap anymore in a sense that anybody can get it anywhere. It used to be that if you wanted to you want to have great knowledge, you had to memorize it, right? You had to learn it and memorize it and so forth. But knowledge is cheap anymore. You can just look it up. So I don't mean that in a negative way, but it is. It's just having that knowledge is no longer as necessary. Having it memorized and in your mind, and it becomes absolutely obsolete in the modern era. Right. I mean, just think about how quickly technology changes. And so just keeping up with technology, for example, is smartphones didn't even exist until about 20 years ago. Yeah. And so, I mean, I think it was 2007 when the iPhone came out. So just saying about how far we've come and how quickly they change still today, smartphones. I'm terrified to get a new phone anytime. I've had the same phone forever, and I'm terrified to get a new one because I don't want to have to learn a new phone. It's so different. I can barely operate our TV anymore. We've got so many different apps and streaming things, and you can do so much just on our TV that I'm almost terrified to use it. Right. So these advancements, though, in technology and information and everything else, it seems to come faster and faster every day. So what we learn today may be different next week. We've got to be able to keep up with that. Knowledge, is not the same. It does not have the same value as it used to in the sense that it's easily accessible and that it changes so quickly. So we've got to consider that as an institution as well. How are we going to keep up with that? So I don't know. I don't have the answer to that. Uh, and then virtually all information is now accessible via technology, making these global skills like critical thinking, communication, collaboration. These are the skills that are really a priority over rote memorization for all the reasons that we've talked about. Okay, that information is available. So what the younger generations really crave and understand that they need are these kind of global skills, what we call global skills. Again, creativity, critical thinking, communication, collaboration, the ability to do these things. Adaptability is another one. Problem solving. These are the type of skills that they're craving and that they value. This is even more evident with the widespread availability and use, for example, of generative AI tools. I know this is a topic that, you know, all of us in some ways may be tired of talking about. Some of you are excited to talk about it, but it seems like every meeting and every topic of discussion anymore involves AI in some way. But uh, this is making the case more and more for why these global skills are all the more important. AI may literally know everything. Again, information is somewhat cheap in that sense. AI knows everything, of course, all of the knowledge, it has all that, but it falls to the user then to discern the validity, the relevance, the appropriate use of that information. And doing that requires these global skills, these skills of, again, critical thinking, problem solving, communication. How do you appropriately use all that information, and how do you sort through and discern what is valuable and what is not from all the information that's available? That's the real trick anymore. It's not gaining that information. It's knowing how to assess it and how to use it then. Okay,
Josh,
so
I
as
do
a
notice you've got quite a few comments in if
okay,
you want to run through them real quick or not,
yes,
but there's some great comments in there that I thought you might want to check out.
absolutely, absolutely. So I'm sorry if I'm pausing here for a second and quiet for a second, but I'm going to look through the chat. Um, yeah, course design. I mean, if any of you are instructional designers, um, my heart kind of goes out to you because this is going to be a real challenge in some way. It just provides a lot of challenges for you're right that the design for nonlinear thinking and providing a roadmap for those. Yeah, for a more direct path, it's going to require multiple designs almost for a class. Yeah, UDL absolutely. It's going to impact UDL. Um, Yeah, and you're right. Some faculty are going to have a tough time transitioning to this or may not want to. I've had that too as technologies, become more and more a part of the classroom. There are some instructors who say, I don't really want to do that. I only want to teach really face to face. I don't understand why I have to do all this other stuff. But that's just the reality of it. So that can lead to some difficult conversations about, is this the right spot for you? Because, it's becoming more and more important and and we can't teach the same way that we used to. I mean, you can, but it's probably not going to be as effective. Um, so yeah, having to have that flexibility and things. Um, yes, the yeah, absolutely. Generational style of the instructor will matter, Leanne, and does matter. I mean, you can kind of tell. Well, I would say I've kind of not to toot my own horn, but I've made this transition. It's becoming easier for me, but it was not easy to begin with. Again, as a Gen X instructor, I grew up and in that sage on the stage environment. So when I started teaching, that's what I did because that's what I knew and that's how I learned, right? And then slowly over time, I learned that I had to adapt as well. So, and the good news for me is that I had a really good friend and colleague who kind of goaded me into that or coaxed me into it. I don't know how you want to put it, but it's how I want to put it, but really challenged me to rethink how I approach these things and that has been but it's not been an easy transition. Yeah, the generational learning style of the instructor and probably most instructors, or a good number, not most, I guess anymore. I'm getting old, so but a good number of instructors who've been doing this for a while are part of that Generation X or baby boomer generation, and so that is going to be a very big challenge for us as instructors to be able to adapt um, to that. But it's going to be a necessity, it's going to be a necessity. Um, Yeah, and Hannah, I absolutely. You've had instructors that had never taken an online class before. That was me when I first started teaching online. I'd never taken an online class and didn't really understand. To me, it seemed, I approached it more like a correspondence course. But I've really, again, had to learn and grow and evolve over time. And now, of course, I teach it. I mean, I teach fully online and have for a number of years now. So I've really had to adjust and retool and reevaluate my own instructional style and move from that sage on the stage to the guide on the side to really thinking. I remember I tell, and this is true. When I was in college, in particular, I would tell you my instructors didn't give a crap what was going on with me. It just didn't. It didn't matter to them. If the assignment was late, it didn't matter why it was late. It didn't matter if it was 3 seconds late, then it was a zero, right? And that's it. And they would have said, "Yeah, we're just teaching you a lesson for you." But that's not how things work, at least in my mind. So again, when I first started teaching, that's how I was too. I was a real hard case with that kind of stuff. But I've had to learn to be more flexible with that kind of thing. And really, part of that is just coming to an understanding that the most important thing for me is the learning. Yes, there are lessons to be learned from having things in on time, and that's great. And they should have things in on time. But also, especially now, I work in an institution where we have primarily adult learners, I mean, older adult learners who have families, who have lives, who have jobs, who are some of our students. It's not uncommon for a student to contact us and say, "I'm sorry, my assignment was late. I just lost my home." And I'm living out of my car and I'm having trouble finding a place with Wi-Fi where I can connect to do my work. I mean, heartbreaking stories like that, right? That I mean, if I were a real hard case, then I would say, nope, sorry, that's a zero. But understanding that life happens for our students, and that's not just a generational thing, but it's, something that I've had to adapt to generationally, coming from Gen X to be more open to things like that. And but yeah, I do think Margie, that's a great. requirement to have your instructors take an online class before they can teach one. Our dean did a similar thing a couple years ago. She made all the full-time faculty go into a class as a student. And not one of their classes, just take another class as a student just to see what it's like to have that burden in addition to your whole job, have that burden of I got to get these assignments done. And I got to, it was really enlightening. So yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's absolutely a great summary, Margie. Boomers and Generation X need the how. Yeah, that's exactly right. And X, Y, and Z need more why. And yeah, that's a great way to summarize that. Yeah. Yeah. Yes, we are absolutely surrounded by knowledge now, for sure. So I'm just scrolling through the comments still. So feel free to throw anything else out there if you want to. But, yeah, Leanne, that's a great point about LLMs and generative AI tools and things. And the knowledge is cheap. When I say knowledge is cheap, I just mean it's readily available, right? But you're right. That doesn't mean it's correct, which is why those global skills like critical thinking and problem solving and being able to discern the value of that information is more important now than ever because you're right. We have access to all this stuff, but we have to be able to identify and suss out what is accurate, what is relevant, and then how to appropriately use it. How to use it ethically and appropriately. Just because it's available doesn't mean we can just wholesale grab it. I mean, those are questions that we have to evaluate as well and think about. So, um, yeah, the expertise and truth will become more expensive, not less. Absolutely. Yeah. And I think, yeah, the expertise will become kind of those global skills about how to use that information and how to apply it. And, when so much is available, when all that information is available, it's a question of who can use it best and who can use it within the correct boundaries and things. So, um, oh, good. I'm glad you thought it was a nice overview because that's where I'm at too. I'm just at the overview stage in many ways. Again, that's why that one slide had considerations and not solutions on it. So, um, okay, good. Okay, I think I'm totally covered. Do any other discussion? Well, this is the end. This is all I had for you, basically. Um, so again, just to wrap up, I would just say that at the end of the day, this isn't a problem to be solved so much as information to be aware of. I'm trying not. I tried not to present this as this is a real problem. This is a negative thing. The truth. It's just the truth. It's just the reality that we have different generations who learn differently, and linear versus nonlinear learning is a thing. It's not a good thing or a bad thing. It just is a thing, right? But again, you noted on that one slide, it's titled Institutional Considerations, not Institutional Solutions. But hopefully, this will broaden our understanding of how and why students may engage in the learning process differently. This technology-driven generational divide isn't the only factor in these differences, but I do believe it's one that's worth noting, right? Um, so that's why I'm happy to stick around and answer any or talk more and answer any questions. Um, I know there's the session survey that they'd appreciate. There's a link for the session survey in the chat there. If you could do that, that would be great. I know the conference organizers really appreciate that information, and that would be great. So, what are the questions we haven't asked that you think we should be thinking about, or that you wish we had asked? That's a great question, um, and I don't know that I have a good answer for that one. Because again, this presentation in particular has more questions for me than answers in many ways. So, I think the questions you've been asking are great. The biggest question for me is how do we then adapt to having these different generational differences and not just linear and non-linear learning. That's just one I picked in particular, but there's a lot of, generational things that are different. But so how do we then adapt? I'm more of a practical application type oriented person too. So my big question is, okay, so what do we do with this? I don't know that I have an exact answer for that. We've talked about some of those things, but I think awareness is the first step. Being aware that there are differences worth considering here. Again, not they're not the only ones, but they are some important ones, I think. And then how do we go about implementing that in the classroom? Again, for me, it's been not only providing from an administrative point of view, providing access to different materials and access to different ways to access those materials for students and to approach and engage with those materials, but then also trying to be more cognizant of that when I engage with students. Um, for example, this isn't I'm painting with a really broad brush here, but Generation X, which again I'm firmly in that Generation X category, is kind of known for accused of being very blunt and being too opinionated, and I certainly am that. So, but I find myself having to think about when I'm responding to a discussion board or something, how is the student going to take this? Because I'll just come on, or in our we have live chats. We're with students in a synchronous way using Zoom, just like this, right? With every week with students, and I always ask a question of the day, and it's something silly. It'll be like, "What's your favorite ice cream?" or "What's your favorite, do you like hot coffee or cold coffee?" or something like that. And when the student answers, I mean, I'll just tell them like if they give an answer, if I ask what's your favorite ice cream and they said like I don't know, um, black cherry cordial or something like that, I would say, oh, what a terrible choice, what an awful choice, Or somebody said plain vanilla, I'd say, come on, plain vanilla, that's so boring. Why would you choose that? And then I have to think to myself, wow, some people from younger generations, that's not an acceptable way to approach. Even though I'm kidding, I'm really just trying to have fun and loosen things up. There are people who would that would probably curb their engagement in the class because they don't want to hear me say, "Well, that's a dumb answer," or "That was stupid." Even on a question about ice cream, right? Does that make sense? So I really have to watch um, how I approach students in that way, and especially students that may be from younger generations who may not be accustomed to that or may not appreciate um, that kind of response. And so even if it's meant in jest, I really have to, I found myself having to watch that because that's absolutely not what I don't want to curb engagement. I want the opposite. Obviously, I want people to engage. So I find myself, I was talking about this in my class the other day. I'm not a cheerleader type person, right? I'm not a sunny, I mean, I have a good attitude and I easy to get along with, but I'm not somebody who's just like, yeah, smiling all the time. And boy, isn't this great? And but I am in class. I am in class. My wife and kids laugh at me when they've heard me teach because I get that way in class because, again, I want to encourage that engagement. So I fake it until I make it with that kind of attitude. So just thinking about those kind of things too, the differences in how we engage with students in the classroom. And as somebody said, what's normal for those of us who are instructors who are Gen X or baby boomers wouldn't necessarily be for our students that are younger generations. So understanding that just because it's the way it happened for us and just because it's the way we might normally do it, could be prohibitive in the classroom for students from younger generations and keeping them from engaging as much as they would or could otherwise. So um, anyway, that's the question that was a very long answer to that question, but that's what I think of a lot of times. I know we're getting up to time here, so any other last minute thing? Let me forward one more. This is my email. My email's on here. It's just jrockey@coloradotech.edu. So feel free to email me if there's anything I can, um, any way I can help further discussion or share any resources that I might have with you. I'd be happy to do that. But anything else before we're getting close to time, and I don't want to push us over here. So,
You're doing great. We've got a few minutes yet, so
okay, good. Okay, great. Well, this was wonderful. I really appreciate you giving me the chance to just kind of think about these things out loud, really. That's kind of what this presentation was just thinking about some things out loud. And so I really appreciate you
yeah.
putting up with that and hopefully I'll give you some things to think about as well. Yeah. That'd be wonderful. I will accept that outcome all day, every day. And I hope you have enjoyed the conference so far. I hope you continue to enjoy it. And I think it's a wonderful experience. So, and again, feel free to hit me up if there's anything I can do. And don't forget the survey, right? There's a link in the
Yes,
chat for
there was a link in the
completing the
chat.
survey.
Mhm.
All right. Well, thanks.